On Tuesday morning, the 3rd of May, 1881, a 34-year-old German woman named Mena Muller crossed the Christopher Street ferry from Manhattan into New Jersey, carrying $116 in her pocketbook, a gold hunting case watch engraved with flowers on its outer case, and a bottle of Rhine wine that she planned to open with the minister who was going to marry her that afternoon. By nightfall, she would be dead in a wood outside Weehawken. The man she crossed the river with was going by the name of Louis Kettler. Mena believed he was a bricklayer from Alsace who owned property in the town of Mulhausen, and who, once they were married, would take her home to Europe. Her furniture had been sold the day before. Her 4 trunks and a bundle of bedding were already waiting at a boarding house on Christopher Street, addressed for a French steamer that was to sail the next morning. She was leaving New York for good, or so she believed. She was one of many thousands of German-speaking immigrants moving between the tenements of the East Side and the ferries that spring. But Louis Kettler was not his real name. The record of the wedding, written down that same afternoon in the register of the Grove Reformed Dutch Church on the Weavertown Road, gave his age as 33, his trade as bricklayer, his father as Louis Kettler, and his birthplace as Catenheim, Germany. 2 of those facts were true, his age and his trade. Everything else had been invented for the marriage certificate. The man beside Mena on the ferry that morning had a wife of 10 years and 2 small children living in one room on the west side of Manhattan. Neither of the women he was married to that day knew about the other. The Grove Reformed Dutch Church stood on a quiet stretch of the Weavertown Road in the German-speaking corner of Hudson County. Its pastor was the Reverend Dr. Mabon, a careful man who kept precise records. On the afternoon of the 3rd of May, a woman came to his parsonage alone and asked him to perform a marriage. He said yes. She stepped back out to fetch her man from the yard. That yard is the second detail Mabon's household remembered. The groom had been pacing it while the bride went to the door, back and forth, his head down, as if his mind was somewhere he did not want it to be. Mabon's servant girl, watching from a window inside the house, saw a stout man with a full face, a dark mustache, and a high flat-topped derby hat. She said afterward that he walked as if something was wrong. The couple had brought no witness of their own. Mabon called in a barber from Union Hill named John Schumann, whose only task that afternoon was to sign the register and go back to his shop. The register recorded them as Louis Kettler and Mena Schmidt, both born in Catenheim, both marrying for the first time. Neither of those things was true. Mena Schmidt was Mena Muller, and she was already married to a New York tobacconist named Simon. Louis Kettler was neither Louis nor a bachelor, but the vows were made in legal form, and Mabon, under oath at the inquest 16 days later, said one thing about the groom that would stay in the record. At the time, he told the coroner, I noticed a tear in his eye. That was as much as Mabon would ever say about the man's inner state, and it is more than the record gives us anywhere else. Mena Muller is the name we hold on to here because the Philadelphia pamphlet that carried her story a few months later took the killer's word for her and put it in the title instead. If there is a case you would like restored the same way, leave the name in the comments and we will follow it up. The couple's walk back from the parsonage into the town left several witnesses. The first had already met them before the wedding. Sarah Jane Rigler, who lived along the road near the church, had been stopped by Mena that morning for directions. "Can you please direct me to a priest?" Mena had asked. "Do you want a priest or a minister?" Rigler had answered, "I want a Protestant priest. I am going to be married." Rigler pointed her toward Mabon's house. She would identify the man beside Mena when she saw him again in the drill room of a Hoboken police station 2 weeks later. The next stop was Edward Stable's Inn on the Weavertown Road. Mena went in alone to buy the Rhine wine. Stable did not stock it. He sent his granddaughter, a girl named Lizzie Haas, up the road to Eberling's store to fetch a bottle. While the girl was gone, Mena talked. She told Stable about the marriage that afternoon, about the cigar store she had once run with her first husband, and about the steamship that was going to take her to France. The bottle came back. Mena paid 50 cents for it out of a $5 gold piece that Stable changed for her, and left the child a 10-cent tip. The man waiting outside the inn, whom Stable had barely looked at, did not come in. Mrs. Stable, watching from inside, later remembered a further detail. Mena had told her that the wedding had been kept from her brother, who disapproved of the match. Mrs. Stable was certain of the day, the 3rd of May, because a burial had taken place in the Grove Church Cemetery that afternoon. The last stop of the walk before the ferry was a saloon on Pierce Avenue in West New York, kept by a woman named Mrs. Frink. Frink watched the couple sit at one of her tables in the middle of the afternoon. The woman ordered beer. The man ordered soda water. The woman paid the bill herself out of a roll of banknotes in her pocketbook, with silver and gold underneath it, that Mrs. Frink could not help but notice. Before leaving, Mena asked to borrow a corkscrew. She had a bottle of Rhine wine, she explained. She was going to open it later with her husband. 4 independent witnesses, on the last afternoon, Mena Muller was recognizable as a living woman, had watched her walk through their doors. In October, each of them would take the stand in a Jersey City courtroom and describe her without hesitation. Not one of them, from the witness box, would be able to describe the man beside her. 10 days went by. The wine Mena had bought at Stables was probably still on a table somewhere. Her trunks and bedding were being carried between addresses she had never been to, and in a strip of woods above the Bull's Ferry Road, 100 feet in from Bergen Avenue and 20 feet aside from the path, she was lying under leaves. On Friday morning, the 13th of May, a German man whose name no source ever recorded went into those woods to gather green leaves. He sold them to florists in Manhattan. He worked that stretch of hillside often. On this morning, he turned aside from the path and nearly stepped on her. Coroner Wiggins of Hoboken came out that afternoon. His notes were exact. A deep gash on the left side of the top of the head, and beneath it the skull was fractured. A second gash over the right eye. The nose broken in the middle. Both wounds appeared to have been made by the edge of a stone. Her face, exposed to the sun for days, had darkened. Her features were small and even. She wore buttoned shoes of a small size, number 1 or number 2. Wiggins added one further note. The left ear was torn, as if an earring had been ripped out of it. He looked for the earring in the leaves and grass around her. It was not there. Nor was the gold hunting case watch that Mena had been wearing when she stepped onto the ferry. The coroner judged her to be about 25. He was 9 years too young. She lay in the Hoboken morgue for 5 days without a name. On the 18th of May, a New York tobacconist named Simon Muller came to the morgue with his sister-in-law. His wife, Philomena, whom everyone called Mena, had been missing since the beginning of the month. The sister, Maria Schmidt, stopped in the basement of the building and did not go in. Simon went into the vault. He looked at the body calmly and identified the cameo brooch he had once given her and her clothing. Without hesitation, he confirmed that she was his wife. Simon and Mena had been married in 1874 and had lived together for 3.5 years above his cigar store on West 39th Street. She had left him in January. On the day at the morgue, when the coroner later asked how many years they had been married, Simon said 5. The record says 7. The coroner did not press the point. Simon had one thing more to tell the inquest, which he offered without being asked. On the 4th of May, 2 weeks earlier, he had gone to the pier of the Transatlantic Steamship Company and had stood at the gangplank of the vessel L'Amérique from before it began to board until after the last passenger had crossed it. His wife had told her sister she was leaving for Germany that morning with a new man. Simon had come to see her leave. She had not come. He did not know until the morgue. Why? There was one further piece of testimony about Simon Muller, given not by him but by Mena's brother, Carl Schmidt, under oath a day later. Mena had told Carl on the Sunday before her death that her husband had once tried to shoot her. There is no other source for this statement anywhere in the record. It is Carl's word, saying his sister's word, about the man who wept 2 days later at her graveside. The Mena Muller who left Simon in January is not quite the Mena Muller who walked into her brother's flat on the 1st of May and told him she had $116, was leaving for Alsace on Tuesday, and had already given notice at the butcher shop where she worked on 3rd Avenue. Something had changed between January and May. Part of what changed can be dated exactly. On the 3rd of March, she had rented 3 top-floor rooms from a landlord named Charles Rost at 1511 2nd Avenue. She furnished them herself, comfortably, with curtains and covers of her own choosing. She told Rost she was a widow. Her husband, Muller, she said, had died of consumption and had left her $1,000 in insurance. Rost was suspicious. A widow of a week or a month should have worn mourning, and she did not. About 5 weeks after she moved in, he saw her one morning arranging her curtains, and he teased her from the hall. "You ought to have a husband here, Mrs. Muller," he said. "Oh, I have got one," she answered. "My name is Mrs. Kettler now." She was, by then, living with the man who called himself Louis Kettler. He gave the neighbors his own account of things, calling himself a mason and a paper-hanger, and telling anyone who asked that he was doing well. Some of the tenants noticed that he seemed uncertain in his English and in his American manners. One of them called him a greenhorn. He had been in the country a little over 7 months. The $1,000 from a dead husband did not exist. What did exist was a policy for the same amount from a fraternal order called Lodge Number 70, Knights and Ladies of Honor, which Mena had joined years earlier and which would only pay out if she died. In the first year of her marriage, she had signed the beneficiary line over to Simon. On the morning of the 3rd of May, on her way from her brother's flat to the ferry, she stopped at the office of the lodge. Its president, a man named Louis Schlesinger, was in. She asked him whether the beneficiary of her policy could be changed. He said it could. She asked him to take Simon's name off and put her sister Maria's name in its place. He asked her whether there was a reason. She said she was going to France that afternoon. If anything happened, she said, she wanted the money to go to Maria. Schlesinger did what she asked. She left his office and went down to the ferry. None of this makes her simple. She was leaving one husband and walking toward another. She was inventing a widow's story for her landlord and a bachelor's marriage record for a minister. She was also being careful with her sister's future in a way that suggests she knew, on the last morning of her life, that some part of her plan might not work out. The Barclay and Company pamphlet that would be printed in Philadelphia later that year took the phrase her killer used at his arrest and made it the frame of her story. She was, in that document, the wicked woman who led him astray. The record supports something else. She was a woman in motion, and someone whose path was going to end her had already crossed it. 10 days after Mena Muller was buried under leaves above the Bulls Ferry Road, and while the New Jersey Attorney General was telegraphing the port of Le Havre to have Louis Kettler arrested on arrival, the man who called himself Louis Kettler was in a small room at 179 Charles Street in Manhattan, reading the New York papers. His landlady, a Mrs. Clifford, remembered him well when a reporter came asking. A few days later, he had taken the room on the evening of the 4th of May. He kept the shutters closed during the day. He read the papers with unusual attention. He went out mostly at night. He had paid her once with a $5 gold piece. When he left on the 14th, he told her he was moving to California. He took 3 of his 4 trunks with him. The 4th, full of crockery, he left in her hall. That was the same evening a Hoboken detective named Edward Stanton was preparing to sail after him. The theory in the case was that Kettler had boarded the L'Amérique on the morning of the 4th of May and was already crossing the Atlantic. A young Jersey City newspaper reporter named Gustavus Seid did not think so. He had spent the morning of the 19th of May tracking down the man who had actually moved Kettler's trunks. Seid found him at a fish market on the corner of West and Gansevoort Streets. His name was C.A. Strang, a truckman with a red truck and one brown horse. Strang had not taken the trunks to the steamship pier. He had taken them to a boarding house at 179 Charles Street. 10 days later, he had moved 3 of the 4 trunks again, this time to a tenement at 5 West 36th Street. Seid went to Mrs. Clifford's, spoke to her, and had the address on 36th Street by early afternoon. By evening, he and Detective Stanton were standing across the street from that tenement, watching the entrance. So was a New York police officer, dispatched by the 20th Precinct on an entirely unrelated matter, who mistook Seid for the wanted man and arrested him. The confusion was sorted out at the station. Everyone went back to the tenement. A little after 9 that night, a man in his early 30s came walking up the street from the west. Officer Fitzgerald stepped out of the shadow at the corner and put a hand on his shoulder. The man did not resist. He looked at Fitzgerald, then at the second officer behind him, then at the tenement door he had been walking toward. He said one thing in German, and then said it again, and then a third time. Was ist. His name was not Louis Kettler. It was Martin Kenkowski, and he was a bricklayer from Alsace who had been in the country about 7 months. He was married, but not to Mena Muller. His wife, whom the police were about to meet, was on the 2nd floor of the tenement in front of him. In one of the trunks the officers carried down that night, they found a letter addressed to Mrs. Mena Muller at her old apartment on 39th Street, from Germania Lodge number 70. In another, they found a shirt with blood on the sleeves from the wrists to the elbows, on the front, and on both sides at the waist. In a room on West 35th Street, a watchmaker named John E. Luthi was holding a receipt he had given Kenkowski 3 days earlier for a gold hunting case watch engraved with flowers, brought in for repair. Katrina Kenkowski lived on the 2nd floor of the 36th Street building, in one room, with her husband and their 2 children. Her son was a small boy who cried easily. Her daughter was about 6. Katrina and Martin had married 10 years earlier in Alsace and had come to New York the previous winter, a little more than half a year before that night. She learned that something was wrong when the police arrived to take the trunks. She followed them to the station, with the boy in tow and the girl in her arms, and no clear idea of what her husband had done. At the desk of the 37th Street Precinct, through a German-speaking interpreter, an officer asked her whether she knew her husband had married another woman and killed her. "I do not believe it," she said. The officer asked again. She said it again. "Let me see him." Then, turning to the boy, whose crying was climbing, "Do not cry, my child. You will make me weep." Her voice caught on the last word. She burst into tears. 2 women who had never known the other existed had been married to the same man on the same day. One of them was dead in a wood outside Weehawken. The other was standing at a police desk on 37th Street with a child in her arms. They had lived a mile apart in the same immigrant German-speaking city, on the same island. They would meet now through the iron trellis of a cell door. The officers walked Katrina down the corridor toward her husband's cell. She held the boy against the bars. Kenkowski was somewhere back in the darkness of the cell. When he heard the child and the voice of his wife, he shouted from where he lay, "Katrina! Katrina! Merciful heavens, my child! My child!" He rushed forward to the front of the cell. His face pressed against the iron trellis. His hands went through the bars. He was, according to the officer watching him, one of the most powerful men the officer had seen. The muscles were moving in his sleeves as he gripped the iron. "Before God I stand a guiltless man," he said. "I was misled by the wicked woman. She led me astray. His hand was through the gate. Katrina took it. The child sobbed against her skirt. She could not speak for a long time. When she did, she asked him a question that has stayed in the record intact. "Have I not been a good wife?" she said. "Have I not prayed to God for you?" He said nothing to that. He went back to saying he was innocent. She stood there, holding his hand until an officer led her and the children out. Kenkowski called after her from the darkness. She did not turn. There is a second scene from the following morning that belongs here as well. A crowd of some 400 people had gathered outside the station overnight, calling for him to be lynched. Katrina came back through it, holding the girl and dragging the boy by the hand. When she reached the front of the station, the officers brought her husband out of the cell to be taken across the river to Hoboken. He stepped toward her with his arms open. She turned her face away and let him kiss only the side of her neck. Her daughter, 6 years old, made a pushing motion with her hand and drew back. Then the crowd outside howled, and Kenkowski turned pale, and Katrina fainted onto the floor. At some point, either that morning or on the following Sunday when she visited the jail, Katrina asked her husband about a $5 gold piece that had gone missing from her savings on the 3rd of May. That was the day of Mena Muller's death. It was also the day he had come home to the 36th Street tenement after being away for what he had told her was work. He admitted in that quiet conversation that he had taken the money. He had taken from Mena Muller on the day he killed her. He had taken from Katrina Kenkowski on the same day. Both women had been keeping something aside for what came next. Both women had been trying to build the ground under their families. He had walked across the ferry with one of them in the morning and had come home to the other that night and had taken from both. Katrina told a reporter that week that Philip Emden, the neighbor who had first pointed the police toward her husband, had been a good friend to her and to her poor little ones. She said nothing more about her husband on the record. Under oath at the Hoboken inquest, a young woman named Regina Herkfeld gave the coroner a story that had begun on the 9th of May. Herkfeld was 20 years old, from Newark Avenue in Jersey City, and had been looking for work as a domestic servant. She had gone that day to an employment office on Mott Street. There she had met a man who matched Kenkowski's description in every particular. He had hired her for housework and had taken her to a boarding house at 149 Charles Street, 3 doors down from where Kenkowski himself had been staying since the murder. Once inside, according to her sworn statement, he locked her in a room and treated her criminally. He then took her purse and a ring from her finger and walked out. She followed him and lost him in the streets around 35th Street and 10th Avenue. He came back. Some days later, he appeared at her brother's place of business, saying he wanted to marry her. He went to her house. He told her he was leaving for Chicago, and he offered her 2 things as a parting gift. The first was a gold hunting case watch engraved with flowers, the inside case of which did not look like gold. The second was a chased ring with a round dark blue stone set in a crown of 4 claws. He let her hold the ring, but took it back, promising to send her another from Chicago. Chief Donovan of the Hoboken Police brought Regina Herkfeld into the drill room of the station on the 20th of May to identify Kenkowski among a group of other men. She walked in, saw him, pointed her umbrella at him without hesitation, and spoke 3 words in German. Das ist der Mann. At the inquest, the watchmaker John E. Luthi was called next. He confirmed, under oath, that Kenkowski had brought a gold hunting case watch with flowers engraved on the outer case to his shop on West 35th Street on the 16th of May, and that he had given him a receipt for it. The watch that had crossed the Christopher Street ferry on Mena Muller's chatelaine on the 3rd of May had been left at a watchmaker's on the 16th. In between, it had been offered as a courting gift to a young woman Kenkowski had assaulted 6 days after the killing. Under cross-examination, Regina Herkfeld considerably modified her earlier statement about what had happened to her at Charles Street. The record does not say how or by how much. What she never modified was her recognition of the man in the drill room. On the morning of the 20th of May, an undertaker named Martin Sanger came to the Hoboken morgue and placed Mena Muller in a plain coffin. On the lid, he fixed a silver plate that gave her name as Mena Muller, her date of death as the 3rd of May, 1881, and her age as 34 years. Beside it, he set a small shield with a German inscription, Ruhe in Frieden, rest in peace. A wreath of flowers had been braided with her name. The coffin was driven to Carl Schmidt's flat at 555 9th Avenue. A crowd, mostly of German women, was waiting on the sidewalks. Wagons had blocked the street, and men and boys had climbed the columns of the elevated railroad to see her arrive. 6 carriages, carrying her husband and her brothers and the officers of the lodge, followed the hearse to the Lutheran cemetery. At the graveside, Louis Schlesinger, president of Lodge No. 70, read the ritual of the Knights and Ladies of Honor. Simon Muller, standing beside her brothers, wept through the service. The record does not say whether Maria Schmidt wept as well. She had inherited, 3 days before her sister's death, everything that could be inherited. Schlesinger told a reporter afterward that the lodge would pay Maria the $1,000 in full. The money had been signed over to Maria that same morning, before Mena walked down to the ferry with a bottle of Rhine wine. One careful precaution on the last morning of her life. It was the only one that worked. There is a scene from October of that year that lands in the middle of the trial without preamble. It is a courtroom in Jersey City, in the Hudson County Court of Oyer and Terminer. A medical examiner has risen from his seat and is standing in front of the jury with an object in his hands. It is Mena Muller's skull. He shows them the 2 wounds on the left side of the top of the head and above the right eye. He shows them the fracture beneath. Then he sits down. This is where the trial arrives. Before we say how it got here, the prosecution, led by Attorney General Stockton, had spent the previous weeks calling every witness who had seen the couple together on the 3rd of May. Mrs. Frink, the Stables, Mrs. Wrigley, the Reverend Dr. Mabon, and John Schumann the barber, Theodore Scherer of the hotel, the truckman Strang, the watchmaker Luthi, Regina Herkfeld, Charles Rost, Mrs. Schwann the dyer. Between them, they put Mena and Kenkowski at the ferry, at the parsonage, at Stables Inn, at Frink's saloon, in the walk between them, and at the boarding house on Christopher Street. They put Mena's watch in Kenkowski's pocket 3 days later. Not one of them had seen the killing. The defense had one story. Kenkowski said that when he and Mena had left Frink's saloon on the afternoon of the 3rd of May, they had walked as far as the Schutzen Park, where they had drunk beer together. 2 men had come along the road. One of them had greeted Mena by name. Kenkowski said he had turned to her and told her that if she was that kind of woman, he would have nothing to do with her. He had left her with the 2 men and walked away. The 2 men were never found. No witness had ever seen them. Kenkowski attempted a further alibi that fell apart on cross-examination. He said he had asked directions to the ferry from a carpenter putting up a fence that afternoon. The carpenter was located and gave a description of a man who had asked directions on a certain day. The owner of the property then produced the diary in which the fence job had been recorded. The date was several days after the murder. The jury withdrew for an hour and returned a verdict of first-degree murder. Kenkowski fainted as it was read. When his sentence was pronounced in early November, he made a short statement in German through an interpreter, which the reporters wrote down and which the pamphlet later printed in the form it survives. "Since this courthouse has been built," he said, "a more innocent man than myself never stood before this court." His attorney's appeal for a new trial was denied through December. He was hanged inside the Hudson County Jail on the 6th of January, 1882. He made no confession. His last recorded words were in German. The interpreter translated them for the newsman and left the room. The evidence against him had been circumstantial from beginning to end. Every witness had placed him near Mena Muller in the hours before her death. No witness had seen him raise the stone. The watch had been in his pocket, the shirt in his trunk, the letter to her old address in his room, the pattern of a courtship performed again on Regina Herkfeldt 6 days later. The jury had decided what it decided in an hour. Simon Muller went home to his tobacco shop on West 30th Street. Maria Schmidt received her $1,000 from Lodge number 70. Carl Schmidt continued at his address on 9th Avenue. Gustavus Seide wrote up the case for his newspaper and went on to write others. The Reverend Dr. Mebben kept his register. The gold hunting case watch, engraved with flowers on its outer case, that Mena Muller had been wearing on the ferry on the 3rd of May, was entered into evidence at the trial. Where it went after the trial is not documented anywhere. The cameo brooch Simon Muller had given his wife in the first year of their marriage is not documented after the funeral either. Katrina Kankowski disappears from the record after the execution. No source we have follows her, or her boy, or the daughter, who had turned her face away from her father on the morning of the 20th of May. Whatever she came to believe about her husband, in the years after they hanged him, is not documented anywhere. She had said, at the police desk on the night of the arrest, that she did not believe it. That was the last thing about her belief that anyone wrote down.